All right, welcome back. Changing up a little bit, a little different venue today, but welcome back as we're going through our study of Isaiah as we explore the Bible. And we're in session 4. We're going to be picking up in Isaiah chapter 23. So as we're getting started, if you need to pause the video, make sure you have your Bible, make sure you have something to write with and something to write on. Pause, go grab that, come right back, and we'll dive right in. All right, as we're covering through the story of Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, we're Isaiah chapter 23. We're going to cover verses 8 through 18. And our topic today is God reigns. God is in control. And if God controls the rise and fall of nations and powers. God is in control at all time. He reigns. He's sovereign. He's over everything. But as we get started, here's a question we have is what are some things that may cause a person to question who is really in control? What are some things that you may question? And you look back and say, is God really in control of this? Or maybe something that in your life somebody is supposed to be in control of and they're not in control, or you question that. What are some of those things in your life that come up that really make you doubt, make you have concern, have pause when it comes to who is really in control of what's going on? Okay, maybe you just need to think on that a little bit. We can pause, come back, jot down some of those solutions, come back, and we'll keep going, okay? All right, in Isaiah's day, Tyre, the city of Tyre, 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 and Sidon were Phoenician cities on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. They had a vast, powerful financial empire. They were the traders. They had ships, they had boats, and they would go and they would barter and trade and ship things all around the Mediterranean, the known world at the time. And to the human eye, they seemed invincible. They'd been there for years. They were going to continue to be there for years. No one could stop them. But they were no match for God. And God is sovereign over every nation and human seat of power that we have. So real quick, as you're going through Isaiah, we were in Isaiah 7 last week. We're in 23 now. Let me catch you up on some things that have gone on in between that time. In the middle of Isaiah, his message reveals that there will be a time when people come from every nation and stream to the house of the Lord to worship him. Isaiah chapter 2 and Isaiah chapter 11. However, before this takes place, the Lord would bring his purifying judgment on the nations. So, from Isaiah 13, chapter 13 through 23, verse 18, it contains a series of judgment speeches against many of the nations in the ancient Near East. And these proclamations gave the way for Isaiah's message of universal judgment in chapters 24 through 27, which we'll get to next, right? So for chapter 13 all the way up to this point, chapter 23, what we're covering, it's just judgments that go out from nation to nation. But here are some things that you're going to see in all these judgments. If you read through them and you look, sometimes they can get kind of repetitive. Sometimes you're like, why am I reading this? And what do I need to be getting out of this? Let me give you some pointers. If you go back and read those chapters, just a few things that the curriculum says that you can dig into, read, and pull out from, right? So the first thing that you can recognize from all these speeches, from these, I believe it was 8, right? Yeah, from these speeches anyway, is that the Lord rules over all the nations. He's in control of all the nations around Israel that he's talking about when it comes to judgment. The second part is, one, they're all under, so the Lord rules over all the nations. They're all under his authority, and they will answer to him. Secondly, even though Isaiah addresses the various nations in the judgment speeches, the audience that he's talking about really is supposed to be received by the nation of Israel. So he talks about all the surrounding countries and what's going to happen. Why? Because they have turned and they have gone away from God. Except Israel's supposed to know who God is and they're supposed to trust in God, but yet they're making alliances with all these other nations. So in the midst of this, the warning is to the people of God. So one, the Lord rules over all the nations. Two, even though he's talking about all the other nations, it's really addressed to Israel to say, wake up, Israel. Let me tell you what's going to happen to all your alliances. The third thing is these oracles serve as a warning to the people of God. If you act like these nations, then God will treat you like these nations. In fact, he'll show you even more severity than the other nations because you know better. You know how to act. Whereas these nations are pagan nations. They don't know how to act. They didn't walk across the Red Sea when it was crossed. They didn't come out of slavery of Egypt. They haven't seen King David, and they haven't seen all the miracles that God has done and how God has held your nation together. You have. And you have the history of it, and you have the story that goes with it. And because of that, if you still turn your back on God and decide to align with the other pagan nations around you, your severity is going to be worse than them because they're ignorant of who God is, whereas you aren't. Okay, so the Lord rules over everything. He addresses all the other nations, but really focuses in on Israel, of saying, this is what's going to happen to them. Pay attention, Israel. But it's a warning to the people of God. And lastly, all these judgment speeches speak of the destruction of nations and a warning to Israel that they also contain a mess, but they also contain, let me start that over. Although these judgment speeches speak of destruction of nations and a warning to Israel, they contain a message of hope for the people of God. Isaiah 14:32 exclaims, the Lord has founded Zion, and his oppressed people find refuge in her. Therefore, these oracles of judgments against the nations are an exhortation for the people of God to turn away from the foreign alliances, to turn away from their sins, and trust in him alone. The Lord is their salvation. So when you read about all these judgments, the main things you need to get out of it is trust in God and God alone. God is in control. Doesn't matter what it looks like with the nations around you. God is in control. So that's just kind of our intro into this, okay? I know it was a little lengthier intro, but there was a lot of chapters between last lesson and this lesson. I want to make sure you kind of have a foundation for it as we dive in. But as we get started, who's really in control? God's really in control. And as we talk about the nation of Tyre today, Tyre, let's just dive in and look at that. So starting at Isaiah 23:8, I want you to listen how Tyre describes themselves, okay? How do they view themselves as we read? In verse 8, it reads, who planned this against Tyre? The bestower of crowns, whose traders are princes, whose merchants are the honored ones of the earth. So as this proclamation goes out against the city of Tyre, what we see is that you don't normally associate traders and merchants as princes, right? As a prince. And here they're saying that, hey, we trade with the prince. We trade with royalty. And we're so wealthy, we're like royalty ourselves. The arrogance of Tyre to basically say, this is who we are. Who planned this against Tyre? Because we have our own crowns. We don't need your crowns. We buy your crowns and give them to you, right? But whose merchants is honored of the honored ones of the earth? Every nation thinks these Phoenician cities will be there a very long time because they are extremely wealthy. They're extremely powerful, and they have extreme alliances with every nation they do business with. So if you attack Tyre, if you attack Sidon, if you attack a Phoenician city, you're attacking the alliances that these cities have. And as a result, the nations will come and defend their city. Why? Because you're disrupting not just Phoenician city trade, you're disrupting their trade that they do business through. So everywhere in the known world, the businessmen of Tyre were treated with respect because they knew that they were wealthy businessmen. Okay, so what are the dangers of assuming you or an organization are invincible to any attacks of future change? How many times have we sat back and said, you know what, this is just untouchable. We will never see this corporation go away. We'll never see this individual go away because we're just, either they're arrogant or they're so confident in themselves and that we just like, man, I just can't imagine a world without this. Let me give you some examples. How many of us growing up would have ever thought we would not have a Blockbuster? And all of a sudden one day it just disappeared. Netflix came in, Blockbuster was gone, right? What about the Polaroid camera? All of a sudden you don't hear about that anymore. Now it's, you hear about them, but the classic photo ops and they're toys for kids that they can play with. What about Toys R Us? It just didn't stay on the cutting edge and just became like any other store, okay? Pan Am, all of a sudden one of the great and biggest airline companies just went belly up. compact computer, one of the first original computers, and then all of a sudden just couldn't keep up with the competition. And then Enron. I grew up listening about the downfall of Enron. People just, this big, wealthy investment firm that just thought that they were invincible. And then they're either behind bars and a lot of people are out of money because their arrogance caught up to them. So there's all these companies that we have, and everyone is in control by God. And everyone is going to be used by God to further his good purposes. But we have people in our lives, we have people that we know, we have people that we trust in countries, we trust in governments, we trust in corporations, we trust in individuals. But they are all under the authority of God. And if we're placing our trust and our alliances in these things, if we're trusting in our retirement plans and we're trusting in our work and we're trusting in our family, but we're not trusting in God first, all these other things can be taken away. But God is in control at all times. Okay, so let's make sure we don't have the attitude of Tyre. Moving on to our next section. As we read verse 9 through 12, look at the fate that awaits the city of Tyre. So verse 9, the Lord of armies planned it, to desecrate all its glorious beauty, to disgrace all the honored ones of the earth, overflow your lands like the Nile, daughters of Tarshish. There is no longer anything to restrain you. He stretched out his hand over the sea. He made kingdoms tremble. The Lord has commanded that the Canaanite fortress be destroyed. He said, you will not celebrate anymore. Ravished young woman, daughter of Sidon, get up and cross over to Cyprus. Even there you will have no rest. So as we read and we start looking through this, first I want you to look at in verse 9. The Lord of armies. Remember, capital L-O-R-D is the name of God. The Yahweh of armies. The Lord of hosts may be in translation. But here, when we look at God being in control, what do we see? The Lord of armies planned it. God is in control and his forces are in charge. He's planned it. And what's he going to do? He's going to take down the city of Tyre to the spot that it's going to look like the river Nile when it overflows. It's in a desert, and every year whenever the Nile floods, during the rainy season, it floods, it deposits all the silt so that you can grow crops there. And if it ever stops flooding, then all of a sudden the soil isn't rich enough to produce, to be as fertile as it needs to be. So when you talk about the Nile River overflowing its banks and going out, it gets wide and it deposits all this fertilizer, basically the silt that helps out. It says basically that something's going to come in and happen in Tyre. You're going to overflow your banks and you're going to start scrambling to look and get out, but you're going to find no refuge anywhere. You're going to be like the Nile River and you're going to have to flee, get out of your banks, out of your comfort zones, and you will have to go away. So Isaiah has combined the future destruction of Tyre with the past destruction of the Canaanite of Joshua. In verse 11, when we look at the Canaanite fortress to be destroyed, the Canaanites may have had a similar religion like the Baal worship coming from these Phoenician cities more than they did the southern country of Egypt. Egypt had multiple gods and a bunch of different gods, but they weren't the same as the Canaanite gods. The Phoenicians, what they did is when they worshiped was similar to the gods of the Canaanites. So we may see that there's some overlap there. So when he sits there and he says, just like what happened at Jericho, just what happened at the Canaanite fortress, Tyre, they thought they were invincible, but God was in control. Tyre, you think you're invincible, but God is in control. Their arrogance was their downfall. Your arrogance will be your downfall as well. All right? So as we look through this, what attributes of God are most seen in this title? Let's look at this title of the Lord of Armies. What attributes of God do you think of when you think of God being the Lord of the armies? And he planned this destruction. He planned and controlled these things. What other attributes of God jump out to you when you read this passage? And as we're looking at that, as you're thinking on those things, I want you to know that just as we say God controls the rise and fall of the nations, fall of nations and powers, God is just in all he does. God is just in all he does. So when Tyre sits there and says that, hey, we're a wealthy nation, no one can touch us, no one can stop us, They're not trusting in God, they're trusting in themselves. God is just to come and punish them for relying on themselves and not on him, because he's in control of everything. So how does Isaiah's pronouncement show God's justice? And how is recognizing that God is just in all he does just as important as recognizing any of God's other attributes? So just as we recognize that God is just, how do we also, is it important for us to realize other attributes of God in the midst of God's justice? So just pause, think on those questions a little bit. What do we think about God's justice in this context? But also, how does his justice overflow into the other attributes that he may have as well? Pause and we'll come back afterwards. Isaiah presents an example as evidence that God will act. So when I read verse 13 through 14, I want you to look and see what's the evidence pointed to by Isaiah that God acts, okay? So verse 13, he says, look at the land of the Chaldeans, a people who no longer exist, Assyria. Assyria destined it for desert creatures. They set up their siege towers and stripped its palaces. They made it ruin. Well, ships of Tarshish, because your fortress is destroyed. So just as we sit here when we talk about the land of Chaldean, that's really Babylon. And Chaldean was kind of the southern section of Babylon, but that's where all the kings came from. Nebuchadnezzar was Chaldean. And so when you talk about Assyria came in and just laid waste to it. It destroyed it. No one thought that Nebuchadnezzar or that the Chaldeans could be overthrown. But after so many years, Assyria came in and took them out as well. Assyria destined them for desert creatures, basically wiped them off. And what we'll see is Babylon will come back, I believe, later as well. But when we talk about God, the evidence here, he says, look, there was another nation that we thought couldn't be overthrown, but God raised up another nation and took it over. Just as later on, they're going to come up and say the Romans will not be defeated, but after a century, the Romans are no more. You can say that about other countries as well. You can even say that about our country as well. If we're arrogant and we're not turning our hearts to God, then who's to say America, who's only been around for 200-something years, which is really young for a nation, who's going to say we're going to last the test of time if we're not focused on who God is? And here the evidence that he gives us says, Tyre, you're a wealthy place. You have a lot of prestige. You have a lot of things, but yet God is in control and he can lay waste to it and he can come and destroy and take it away if you're not focused on him being in control. So as we talk about those things, God actively directs the affairs of his creation. He actively directs the affairs of his creation. Think back prior to this. What do we have? You got Noah and the flood. You have the plagues in Egypt. You have the crossing of the Dead Sea, the crossing of the Red Sea, and then you also have the conquering of Jericho. So all these things God orchestrates and God directly affects his creation. So how does God demonstrate his power through the affairs of nations? How does God demonstrate his power through the affairs of nations? Pause and just think back through time. Think even in our current situations. How is God directing nations throughout history during this point? How does he demonstrate his power through the affairs of nations throughout our history? Okay, come back and we'll hit our next section. As we look verse 15 through 18, look and see how the pronouncements change from this point forward as we wrap up this section, okay? Just look and see how is it the pronouncement changed. Starting at verse 15, on that day, Tyre will be forgotten for 70 years, the lifespan of one king. At the end of 70 years, what the song says about the prostitute will happen to Tyre. Pick up your lyre, stroll through the city, you forgotten prostitute. Play skillful, sing many songs so that you will be remembered. And at the end of the 70 years, the Lord will restore Tyre, and she will go back into business, prostituting herself with all the kingdoms of the world through the earth. But her profits and wages will be dedicated to the Lord. They will not be stored or saved, for her profit will go to those who live in the Lord's presence and provide them with ample food and sacred clothing. So what we see in these verses is that Tyre, one, was going to be demolished, going to be taken, like it's going to overflow the banks. They're going to be scattered. But after 70 years, they're going to be restored. Now, why would God restore a nation that is not repentant, has not turned its heart, because God directs in the affairs of his creation. He says, I will restore you. He goes, and you will keep basically prostituting yourself out to other nations. You'll be making alliances, you'll be making deals, and you'll be making yourself rich off the wealth of others. But there's going to be a difference here, because just as the time is complete and just as you're going to be restored, the money that you're going to be getting that you used to keep and save and talk about how great you are will be dedicated to the Lord. And so in verse 18, her profits and wages will be dedicated to the Lord. They will not be stored or saved. The profits will go to those who live in the Lord's presence to provide them with ample food and sacred clothing. So even when this restored, what we see is that God is in control. And even though they reigned for a while, God took it away, rebuilds it, and then uses it for his purposes, for his glory, for his people. So God's plan includes all nations honoring him. And that even though that was not what Tyre set out to do, God controlled the situation to allow it, that even this city that doesn't know who he is, when it comes back, will be helping the people that do know who God is. So how do human desires get in the way of honoring God? How does our human desires get in the way of honoring God? And which desires are the greatest obstacles for people when it comes to honoring God? So think in your own personal life, think in other people's lives maybe, but I want this kind of be personal for you. What are your human desires that gets in the way of honoring God? And then what desires are the greatest obstacles for you when it comes to honoring God? Just pause, jot it down in your journal, think on that a little bit, hand it over to God and say, God, I know this gets in my way on a regular basis of honoring you. And I want to turn my heart to you more. So I'm going to write these down and I'm going to hand them over to you. And when this comes up, I want you to be in control of my life. All right? So God's plans include all nations honoring him. Okay? So God controls the rise and falls of nations and powers. Just as we started out with that statement, let's end with that statement, because God controls all. The rise and fall, God is in control of everything. God is just in what he does. God uses everything around us to fulfill his good purposes. He's not in charge of sin, but he doesn't let sin get in his way from him fulfilling his purposes. Because just because we rebel doesn't mean he rebels. It means that he still loves us. He is still just. He is still caring. And he definitely wants us to seek him, honor him, and focus our heart on him. Why? Because he reigns. He is in control of everything. And we just need to submit to his authority. But thank you for joining us today. Got any questions about this lesson, you can always reach out and contact me. But if not, we'll catch you next week. And if not, hopefully we'll see you at church on Sunday for Sunday school and for church. All right? But God bless. Let's close in prayer. Dear God, we do thank you for today. And we trust in you in all things. You are sovereign. You're in control of all things. Let us always give you honor and seek your will and your purposes. And let us not trust in the things around us or the governments around us or the countries around us or the things around us, but let us focus on you and trust in you in all things. Because you're the one that created us. You're the one in control of everything. You're the one that loves us. Let us trust in you completely. In your name we pray and ask it. Amen. Thanks again. God bless.